In this presentation, we're going to examine some of the very interesting material surrounding the question of the appeal of the Franciscan message. That is, what was it about this form of gospel living pioneered by Francis and Clare that attracted the attention of so many other people? And the argument that I would like to make, and I think it's been made well by other authors, is that the old agricultural monasteries did not quite fit the new social reality of the growing urban centers of 13th century Italy, in fact, of Europe generally. They were, if you like, the classic church structures of a previous era, the feudal age. The monastery surrounded by its lands with its abbey in the middle of the property could very well be seen as the mirror of the feudal lord with his castle surrounded by fortifications and by the agricultural lands that supported him, his family, and his soldiers. It will be a shift to a new model of itinerant, wandering preachers that captures the imagination of the new traveling classes of the 13th century. Who were these people? They were people very much like Francis and his family. They were the members of the merchant class. Not nobles. Clare's family came from the nobility. Francis's family comes from businessmen. These are people who are accustomed to moving from place to place because their wealth is portable. It's in the form of cash, which can be moved easily in a small container from one place to the other. If your wealth is in land, in forests and lakes, in water mills and grain production, you can't just pick up your wealth and take it with you. You are tied to the land because that is where your wealth lies. The merchant can move from place to place. If you put that together with a reading of the New Testament, the accounts of the life and ministry of Jesus, as the New Testament was increasingly read by literate members of the merchant class, this looked like a viable way to understand an early form of discipleship. When Francis comes on the scene and offers this as an alternative, merchants throughout Europe respond generously because up until that point, they had been treated like outlaws by the church. Why? Because they were guilty of the sin of usury. That is, they charged more for a thing than what they paid for it. They were seeking profit. But as the friars came in large part from merchant families themselves, they understood profit and, in fact, argued that it was not necessarily a sin. Profit could be used for social good. In the following presentation, I hope you'll be able to glimpse some of the beautiful architecture of the churches built by the urban classes of the 13th century to encourage Franciscan presence, both of poor sisters and friars in their towns. And that you'll get a notion of how the Franciscan family began to grow in its three great branches of the brothers, the sisters, and the brothers and sisters of penance. Enjoy. In this presentation, we will examine the topic of the gospel life in church and society. And the question that we will be asking is, what was the appeal of the three orders associated with the early Franciscan movement? That is, the order of Francis and his brothers, the order of Clare and her sisters, and the order of the brothers and sisters of penance, or the third order. We are looking at what we might call a new way of being Christian. As we have reviewed earlier, The model of the apostolic life was favored in the church of the 13th century. Based on the book of Acts, it led to a stable community life in one place, in which there are offices in the community that are developed and articulated, a life of prayer that was centered in the Temple of Jerusalem, and the breaking of bread in homes. The sale of property by those who joined the community of the faithful produced the income to support the community's needs. We have contrasted this with the gospel life. Based on the example of Jesus and the disciples in the years of his public ministry, this includes an itinerant lifestyle of traveling and preaching. The offices in the community are very basic. Jesus is the only teacher. All others are disciples, men and women who are treated as brothers and sisters. The life of prayer of this group is primarily in the local synagogues of the countryside rather than in the Temple of Jerusalem. And their meals are often taken as guests of others who offer them hospitality. The needs of this group are supplied by donors, notably by a group of women who are co-disciples. Those who join the group are asked to sell their property and to distribute the proceeds to the poor. And there is no evidence of property that is held in common by this group in order to produce income. If we look at the apostolic life, that is, the one that was commonly favored, we can use an example from the century immediately prior to Francis and Clare's new communities. And that's the great monastery of Cluny in France in the 12th century, pictured here in a modern diagram. This community preferred to receive its vocations from the knightly and noble classes of French society. And it was donations from the families of nobles that supported the mass funds. These were used for monks, priests of the monastery, to pray for the deceased, and provided a constant revenue for the monastery itself. Monks at Cluny or nuns in other monasteries would donate a share of their family property on entering a monastery. This was a dowry, the equivalent of what would be negotiated between families at the time of a marriage of a son or a daughter. Those professed religious, those who took monastic vows, were dedicated to a life of a solemn celebration of the liturgy, often very lengthy, time for personal prayer, for reading and study. The large agricultural land holdings of the monastery were worked by peasants to support the large monastic community. The monastery at Cluny itself in the 12th century was the headquarters of a large order that included more than 1,200 monasteries across Europe. Cluny was considered an example of a stable religious life. Its life was learned and aristocratic, but it was strongly tied to the land, unable to move, and self-sufficient over time, especially as new and wealthy families gave new vocations to the monastic community. In contrast, let's look at the life of Francis and his brothers as they live in a different style, which they call the gospel life. Such a life was considered impractical by church leaders. And if we think of the great monastery at Cluny, if that were your model, we would understand this opinion. The itinerant traveling lifestyle, as friars moved from place to place traveling on foot, was considered unstable. It was also considered a marginal kind of existence because Francis and his brothers were operating outside the usual church structures of monastery and parish and diocese. And in fact, their only bishop was the Bishop of Rome, the Pope. They moved across the boundaries of parishes and dioceses and did not settle in proper monasteries. Not only that, but church authorities were concerned, even alarmed, because this group, and it was growing, could show no permanent source of income. That is, they had no property to supply them with food or with rental income. How would they survive? And the very practical question, would they become a burden to local bishops? They also had only very basic elements of structure and authority within what they called their brotherhood or fraternity. They had ministers and servants as leaders who were chosen by the group itself for a period of time. But let's take a broader look at the society in which this new experiment in Christian life was taking place. We're looking at a new form of life that's adapted for a new society. This gospel life of Francis and his brothers, while not well suited for the members of the old aristocratic families, was certainly well suited for the new merchant class. These merchants, traveling businessmen, were accustomed to crossing boundaries in the pursuit of business, whether these were diocesan boundaries, national, or even international boundaries. The merchants of the 13th century traveled. They were also used to forming themselves in organizations called communes, self-governing cities, urban centers who were ruled not by a prince or by a bishop, but ruled by those members of the town who governed themselves. People of wealth, whether nobles or merchants, could participate as long as they agreed to uphold the laws of the commune. They were also experienced as merchants in the routine business of electing their own leaders within trade guilds and changing them when that person no longer suited the needs of the group. They also are a class that is experiencing growing literacy, both among men and women, as the need to write and keep documents for business was growing, especially on the international level. They provided a ready audience for itinerant preachers in town squares who frequently recalled the gospel and the New Testament form of life in their preaching, something that literate members of the merchant class could now begin to read for themselves. This audience, these merchants, this emerging new class, were also quite willing to support new religious groups that they met who accepted merchants themselves. And we'll see why that was important in just a moment. Merchants were considered sinners in the eyes of the church at the time of Francis. And until the 13th century, they were considered to be in a permanent state of serious sin simply because they were merchants. Why? Because they charged a higher price for the goods that they sold than what they had paid for them. That is, they were seeking to make a profit. But making profit was viewed by the church as usury, a sin and a serious sin that is condemned in the Bible. For example, in Exodus chapter 22. The merchant class was therefore not a group of acceptable Christians. They were certainly not desirable as monastic vocations or as members of the local clergy. The merchant was a permanent outlaw in the eyes of the church. A new class, a new group of people with influence, very good at social organization, experience in electing competent leaders, but outlaws in the eyes of the church. It's in this context that we can begin to understand the appeal of the gospel life proposed by Francis and his followers. The merchants respond to the message of Francis and his brothers with great generosity. Here we see one of the responses of Santa Croce in Florence, the great church built for the friars by the population of the city of Florence. And this could be repeated many times throughout Europe. Merchants throughout Europe built large churches for the friars in city centers at their own expense. Here was a group of people who understood them, and they were willing to respond generously to the acceptance that they received from the friars. These great churches were not parishes. No one was obliged to attend the friars' church, whether for Sunday Mass or for feast days, holy days of obligation. You were required to attend your parish. The friars' church was, if you like, a free space, a kind of wide open marketplace within the church. No annual donation was required, and all were always welcome. The architecture of the churches themselves, this beautiful example of Italian Gothic filled with light and color, these were inviting places, designed as large preaching halls where a large crowd could be seated with good acoustics for the preacher in that pulpit that you see in a column perched on the right-hand side, just about in the middle of the nave, that is, in the midst of the congregation. But they also offered beautiful liturgies, singing, music. There were also on offer confessors, friars who were familiar with the moral issues of merchants because they themselves often came from merchant families. It was there, among those merchant families, that vocations are recruited here in Florence and throughout city centers of Europe. This was a population that we might say was ripe for the picking. The friars know the members of their audience in this church and the other churches like them from their own personal and family experience. They spoke the same language. They could use the same examples. People understood them, and they preached in the language that people understood. The friars, in addition, like merchants, traveled extensively, and they used fascinating stories of faraway people and places in their preaching. Those preachers also changed frequently as friars from other parts of Italy or from other parts of Europe arrived regularly on preaching tours in the major Franciscan churches throughout the continent. But what about the appeal of Clare and the poor sisters? What was it in their gospel form of life that would prove attractive to women of the 13th century? First of all, the community that Clare establishes under Francis's direction at San Damiano, just outside Assisi, opens religious life to a wider spectrum of women. Clare herself came from a noble family, as did many of the other sisters at San Damiano. But there were also sisters of much humbler background there, and we actually hear some of their voices in the witnesses of the process of canonization for St. Clare. Such a community was supported by people of the town of Assisi, whether merchants or members of the nobility. It was, if you like, an open space, whether for vocations or for the support that the sisters needed to supplement their income. They received both literate and illiterate women as full members of the community. And in Clare's form of life, she makes specific provision for the sisters who do not know how to read, for example, during the celebration of the divine office in Latin. Rather than being located on vast estates in the agricultural countryside, the monasteries like San Damiano and other communities of poor sisters were frequently located in or near urban centers. They only needed a minimum of land surrounding the monastery for privacy of their enclosure. This is spelled out very clearly in the form of life or rule of St. Clare. They didn't need large lands to be worked by others in order to support them. And they did not accept endowments in order to assure the ongoing security of the life of the sisters. Their life was a bit precarious, it was certainly challenging, and it attracted many women to join. And another example is the building of a church. Here we are in Assisi at the great Basilica of St. Clare. It was built by the local town, its local citizens, to honor a new local saint. Assisi even expanded the city walls in order to include a new monastery for the poor sisters, later known as Poor Clares, as it was built next to the basilica in order to house the tomb of St. Clare. On entering a monastery of the poor sisters, many would be surprised to see that the sisters refused the donations of property to the monastery from one who was entering. That is, there was no dowry. Instead, the sisters, like Clare herself, sold their dowry and distributed the proceeds to the poor as a condition for entering the community. Clare's rule, officially called her form of life, is based on participation and the consensus of all the sisters in making decisions. That is, it reflects in many ways the way that decisions were made in the urban commune of Assisi. And there is no agriculture. There are no properties to provide for their support, which also means there are no peasant laborers working basically as indentured servants for the sisters. Rather, it is the sisters' own manual labor. In the case of San Damiano, specifically cloth production, and receiving alms from benefactors in the town. These are what are used to meet the needs of the sisters, which are very basic: food and clothing. Though this way of life might have seemed challenging, even harsh to some people, and though it seemed very impractical to church authorities because it seemed so economically unpredictable, the growth of the poor sisters belie that worry. Here we see the year 1253 and the growth of communities of poor sisters in Europe at the time of Clare's death. At that time, 110 monasteries are identified as those of poor sisters, following more or less closely the form of life that would have been lived at San Damiano. Of these, 68 are in Italy in 1253, but look, just about 50 years later, in 1300, that number has grown to 196. On the Iberian Peninsula, in what is today Spain and Portugal, there were 21 monasteries at the time of Clare's death, and a few years later, there were 57. In France in 1253, already 14 monasteries followed a poor sister's way of life, to increase to 68 at the beginning of the 14th century. In the Germanic, Slavic countries of Eastern Europe, where there were only 8 in 1253, in 1300 there are 46 monasteries. And in Britain and Ireland, the monasteries came a little after Clare's death. By 1300, they numbered 23. And the same number for Dalmatia and areas east of there in what is modern-day Greece, Romania, and the Middle East. This expansion of women's religious life, accessible to a much broader spectrum of women, linked with the ideal of a gospel life, emphasizing poverty, life in community, prayer, and work, combined, we might say, the best elements of earlier monastic life for women and charged it with a new energy coming from the gospel life innovations that Francis and Clare pioneered. Another group of people who spread this message of gospel life far and wide during the lifetime of Francis and beyond are the brothers and sisters of penance, later identified as the Third Order, and today known as the Secular Franciscan Order and Religious of the Third Order. Francis and the early brothers first identified themselves as members of such a group. When asked who they were, they said, "We are penitents from Assisi." Who were these? They were devout men and women, married and single, who we might say are dedicated to a more demanding Christian life than was strictly required of them. Their lives were marked by an increased emphasis on prayer, on fasting, and almsgiving, making them, if you like, exemplary Christians in their local communities. Such groups already existed before Francis and Clare came on the scene, but they were also ripe for this message of a new way of looking at the organization of Christian communities. Their life included service and financial support from their own income for hospitals for the sick poor, hospices for pilgrims, and the care of lepers, a disease, an infectious disease for which no cure was known and which was growing and spreading in the 13th century as it was brought back by crusaders from the Middle East where it was endemic. Many of these penitents were attracted by the example of Francis and his followers. And we can see Francis turning to them, offering them guidance and support as he advises them in those exhortations to the brothers and sisters of penance, also known as the letters to the faithful. But it would take an extraordinary event to bring the life of this new group, the Franciscan penitents, into sharper relief in European civilization. And if one person can be credited with doing the best publicity for the Franciscan Third Order, or the Brothers and Sisters of Penance, it may well be Saint Elizabeth. She was the daughter of the King of Hungary, therefore called Elizabeth of Hungary, but she married Louis, the Landgraf of Thuringia in Germany, therefore also called Elizabeth of Thuringia. At the death of her husband at a relatively young age in the Crusade, as a widow, she decided to join the Franciscan Penitents, or Third Order, inspired by the example of friars who had come to where her castle was located at Marburg in Germany. Inspired by the example of Francis and the way of life of the penitents, she gave away her inherited wealth in order to found a hospice for the sick poor in the city of Marburg. She's pictured here doing what she did for the rest of her life, dedicating herself to serving personally the patients in the hospital, including, in this case, a man showing the characteristic marks of leprosy. She was canonized very soon after her death, just 4 years later in 1235, and the fame of this model penitent woman of Franciscan gospel life helped the growth of the order of penance in the Franciscan family across Europe, as the news of her canonization and the story of her life was read in local churches on her feast day. If we look at the Franciscan movement at the end of the 13th century, the death of Francis and Clare does not stop the growth of the families that they founded. We see three orders developing in their organization and in their geographical spread. At the center of each is the gospel life, this innovative way of understanding Christian discipleship pioneered by Francis and Clare. We have the Lesser Brothers, or the orders of Friars Minor, who will develop in different branches over time with reforms and divisions, but all following that gospel life that is described by Francis in the earlier rule and the later rule. We also have the Poor Sisters, who will later be called Poor Clares. Their gospel life is described by Clare herself in her Form of Life of the Poor Sisters, a document for which she waited 40 years to get official approval and which was finally given to her with the Pope's signature the day before she died. As we've seen, that group also spreads quickly in the 50 years following her death. The Brothers and Sisters of Penance, or Third Order, or secular Franciscans, also spread from their original base around Assisi and the early settlements of Francis's followers. This group of penitents, aligned with the gospel life of the Franciscan movement, find their inspiration in the admonitions and exhortations to the brothers and sisters of penance given to them by Francis as the basis of their rule of life, and in papal documents like that of Supramontem, in which the papacy itself approves and organizes this form of life, originally for groups of the laity, but later also recognizing this as a valid way of life for men and women wishing to form religious communities inspired by the Franciscan vision. All these three major branches of the Franciscan movement still exist today in countries around the world, a great testimony to the enduring legacy of the gospel life of Francis and Clare of Assisi.